The desert had never seen snow. That was the first thing Corporal Dennis Frey noticed when he stepped out of the supply tent that morning, a single white flake drifting down from a sky the color of pewter, landing on the back of his hand and dissolving before he could decide whether it was real. He looked up. Another flake fell. Then another. Round him, soldiers at Forward Operating Base Ridgecrest paused their routines and turned their faces skyward, rifles still on shoulders, coffee cups still in hands, watching the phenomenon with the quiet unease of men who had learned never to trust anything unusual in a war zone. Sergeant Marcus Doyle walked out of the communications trailer and stared at the dunes. A thin white dusting was already settling on the crests, impossibly delicate against the raw ochre sand. "I've been in this theater 14 months, he said to no one in particular. Never seen anything like it. Neither had anyone else. The temperature had been dropping for 3 days unseasonably, dangerously, but snow in the desert felt like a violation of natural law, and soldiers stationed at Ridgecrest watched it with the superstitious attention of men who knew that strange weather sometimes preceded stranger events. Nobody was watching when the battered contractor's truck rolled through the main gate. Nobody, that is, except Captain Daniel Hale, who stood at the edge of the motor pool with a clipboard and noticed the vehicle simply because he noticed everything a habit formed over 11 years of service that had become indistinguishable from reflex. The truck was old, desert bleached, its white paint gone the color of old bone. It stopped near the command tent, and a young woman stepped out. She carried one bag. It was small, the kind of bag that suggested either a very short stay or a very practiced traveler who had learned that everything unnecessary was weight, and weight was the enemy of movement. She wore civilian clothes, worn canvas pants, a gray thermal, a jacket that had been patched at both elbows, no insignia, no rank. She had light brown hair pulled back without ceremony, and she moved across the frozen sand with the unhurried, deliberate stride of someone who had learned long ago that urgency drew attention. Captain Hale watched her approach the command tent. He had the obscure feeling, the kind that good soldiers learn to pay attention to, that she was not what she appeared to be. The command tent at FOB Ridgecrest was larger than it looked from outside a canvas and aluminum structure that served simultaneously as briefing room, operations center, and the psychological anchor of the entire base. Maps covered one wall. A long folding table dominated the center. Overhead lights cast a flat, institutional glow that flattened faces and made everyone look slightly more tired than they were. Admiral Raymond Garrett stood at the head of the table when the young woman was escorted in. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, carrying the particular physical authority that comes from decades of being the biggest presence in every room. His uniform was immaculate even now. Even out here, he had been in the field for 9 days and showed none of it. His medals were arranged with mathematical precision. He had commanded operations in 4 conflict zones and had been decorated by 3 different administrations, and he wore all of this history the way some men wear their age, as something that made further argument unnecessary. He glanced at the file his adjutant placed on the table. Lena Ward, he read aloud, his tone flat. Civilian contractor, tactical assessment support. He set the file down. He did not look up at her immediately. Around the table, a half-dozen officers, 2 captains, a lieutenant colonel, 2 senior NCOs, and Lieutenant Whitmore watched in the particular silence of men, waiting to take a cue from their commanding officer. Assessment support. He finally looked at her. "I'm being told they sent you here 2 days before we launch a desert extraction operation in conditions that are actively deteriorating." "Yes, sir," Lena said. Admiral Garrett leaned back slightly in his chair. "You're aware of the current conditions. Temperature is -8 Celsius and dropping. A weather system is moving in from the northwest. Our meteorologist is calling it a desert blizzard, which is a phrase that I was not previously aware existed. We have a scout unit that lost contact 6 hours ago, last known position 6 kilometers northeast of our perimeter, in territory that our most recent intelligence suggests is contested." He paused. "And they send me a civilian contractor." He glanced at the file again. "For assessment support." Someone at the far end of the table, Lieutenant Whitmore, who had a gift for reading rooms and a weakness for demonstrating it too openly, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but performed the same function. "No offense," Garrett said. and his tone made clear that none was being offered because none was owed. But this is a combat zone preparing for an active recovery operation. Not a situation room in Arlington where someone needs a terrain briefing illustrated with PowerPoint slides. He looked around the table. What exactly is she supposed to assess? The laughter that followed was quiet, controlled, the kind that stops just short of insubordination, the laughter of men who have correctly read what is permitted. Lena Ward did not react. She stood at the entrance of the tent with her bag at her feet and her hands at her sides, and she looked at the maps on the wall with an expression that Captain Hale, watching from across the table, could not immediately classify. It was not embarrassment. It was not anger. It was not the careful, neutral expression of someone suppressing an emotion. It was something else entirely, the focused, unhurried attention of a person cataloging information. She was reading the maps the way a student reads an exam question, with calm and complete concentration. "I can wait outside if you need time to review the operational situation," she said. The quality of it, the absence of apology, the absence of deference, the plain practicality of the offer made several people at the table shift slightly in their seats. It was not defiant. It was simply the voice of someone who had other things to do while she waited and was offering to go do them. Admiral Garrett waved a hand. "Get her settled somewhere. Equipment inventory, maybe. She can make herself useful, counting cold weather gear." He turned back to his maps. "If the weather service is right, we're going to need all of it." Captain Hale was the one who led her out. "Pay no attention to the welcome," he said, when they were outside. The snow was still falling. Fine, persistent, coating the base in a thin, white silence that was at odds with the tension humming through the compound. The Admiral runs a tight operation. He doesn't like variables. He paused. You were a variable he wasn't expecting. Lena glanced at him. "I understand. What exactly is your background?" The file they sent is, he chose the word, carefully minimal. "Tactical terrain assessment," she said. "Mostly desert and mountainous environments, some cold weather theater." Hale looked at her sideways. In his experience, people who had genuinely done interesting things described them in the most boring possible terms. People who had not done interesting things elaborated. He had been in the army long enough to know which pattern he was listening to. He didn't push it. "I'll find you a bunk," he said. "Show you the equipment inventory. Someone will bring you up to the daily ops brief." "Thank you, Captain." They walked in silence for a moment, through the falling snow. The base around them hummed with the particular anxiety of men preparing for an operation they were not certain would go smoothly. Too many small conversations, too many equipment checks, too many sideways glances at the thickening sky. The snow fell on the dunes and dissolved into the cold sand, and here and there it did not dissolve, and the accumulation was slow, but it was real, and it was changing the way the base looked in a way that everyone could see and nobody had a protocol for. Lena looked at the perimeter as they walked. She looked at the northern wire, then at the eastern approach, then at the place where the motor pool faced the desert. Hale watched her looking. She was not sightseeing. By midday, Lena Ward had been assigned to the equipment storage tent, where she was given a clipboard and a thermal inventory list and asked to verify counts of cold weather gear that had arrived 2 days prior. The assignment was, functionally, the work of a supply clerk and not a senior one. 3 different soldiers made variations of the same joke about it over the course of the afternoon, with the specific easy confidence of people who know they are performing for an audience. Private Cody Renfrew, 19 years old, from Lubbock, Texas, delivered his version while passing the storage tent with 2 friends on the way to the mess hall. "Hey, they've got someone checking blanket counts in case the war gets too cold." His friends gave him the expected response. Renfrew glanced into the tent with a grin, looking for the confirmation that the joke had landed. Lena noted a discrepancy in the thermal glove inventory on her clipboard and said nothing. The grin faded. They walked on. Sergeant First Class Vince Coulter was more direct, as sergeants first class tended to be. He leaned into the tent entrance, took in the scene, the young woman methodically working through rows of equipment in the cold, her breath visible, her clipboard annotated in a clear, precise hand, and said, without apparent malice, simply as a statement of fact, "You know this is a forward operating base, right? Not a logistics depot in Stuttgart." "I'm aware," Lena said, without looking up. "Just making sure you understand what's outside the wire," he said. "It's not the kind of place where counting blankets is going to matter much if things go bad." He let the sentence complete itself without saying the obvious endpoint. He shrugged and left. The genuine damage, the kind that was intended to be damage, was done in the afternoon briefing, which Lena attended because Captain Hale had included her on the distribution list for operational updates. It was a small act of professional courtesy that Admiral Garrett noticed the moment she took a seat at the far end of the table. "Why is the contractor in this briefing?" he said, looking at Hale. "Terrain assessment context," Hale said. "She may have useful input on the eastern approach for the recovery route." Garrett regarded her with the patient, faintly amused expression of a man who has decided to tolerate an inefficiency rather than spend energy eliminating it. "Fine." He turned to his intelligence officer. "Situation update." The briefing covered what they knew about Scout Team Bravo's last known position, 6 kilometers deep in a corridor that satellite imagery showed as flat, featureless desert, which the intelligence officer noted was precisely the kind of terrain that made it impossible to say anything useful about actual ground conditions. The weather system was accelerating. Wind speeds were projected to hit 50 kilometers per hour by nightfall. The window for helicopter extraction was closing. The assessment from the meteorologist, a technical sergeant named Billings, who had been in this theater for 11 months, and had developed the slightly haunted look of someone who had spent too long studying weather systems in a place where weather was never supposed to be this bad, was not encouraging. At the end of the briefing, Garrett looked around the table. "Comments? Questions? Anything I haven't thought of?" Lena said quietly, "The approach route on the eastern corridor passes through 2 natural choke points. Current satellite imaging shows surface features on the primary approach consistent with prepared positions, scraped depressions, disturbance patterns that don't match wind erosion or natural terrain features. The geometry of the second choke point in particular suggests deliberate preparation." The room went still, in the particular way of a room that has just heard something unexpected from an unexpected source. "You're reading satellite imagery now," Garrett said. It was not a question, it had the tone of a statement being verified. "I've been studying the available maps and the imagery summaries since I arrived," she said. "The patterns on the secondary approach are consistent with prepared ambush positions in this type of terrain. There's precedent from operations in comparable theaters." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. There was something measuring in his expression, the look of a man deciding whether to engage with something on its merits or dismiss it on its source. He made his choice. "Thank you for your input." His tone made clear the matter was closed. He looked at his intelligence officer. "Anything from the northern approach?" After the briefing, Lieutenant Whitmore caught up with Lena in the narrow corridor between the command tent's inner and outer walls, a place that was neither inside nor outside and that collected the cold drafts from both. "That took some nerve," he said. "Or some naivety. Hard to tell from the outside which one." He delivered this with the tone of a man offering an honest assessment, the kind that doesn't expect a response and doesn't need one. He left. Captain Hale found her an hour later, standing near the northern perimeter wire, looking out at the desert. She was standing the way soldiers stand when they're thinking weight even, body still, fully present in the attention she was directing outward. The snow had picked up since afternoon, fine and horizontal in the wind, catching on her jacket, accumulating in the folds of her clothing without appearing to bother her in the slightest. "He dismissed you in front of the whole room," Hale said. "He dismissed an observation," she said. "Those are different things." Hale was quiet for a moment, considering the distinction. It was, he decided, a meaningful one. "Where did you serve?" he said. She turned to look at him. Her expression was not unfriendly. It was the expression of someone who has been asked this question many times and has a practiced, consistent answer. "My file is accurate," she said, and turned back to the horizon. He stood beside her for a long moment, looking at the same stretch of empty, whitening desert, the dunes beginning to blur at their crests where the snow was accumulating, the darkness thickening to the northeast. He felt, again, that strange and specific thing he had felt when he watched her read the maps in the briefing, the obscure certainty that she was not seeing what he was seeing when she looked out there. She was seeing something more detailed, more populated, more dangerous. He left her to it. The weather hit the base at 1,742 hours, faster and harder than projected. Wind speeds crossed 60 kilometers per hour within 20 minutes of the system's arrival, driving sand and snow in thick horizontal curtains that reduced visibility to less than 30 meters. The temperature dropped to -14. Equipment stowed improperly was lost or buried within the hour. The base's heaters strained under the load, and 2 of them failed in the first hour, sending maintenance teams scrambling in conditions that made working outdoors a genuine hazard. The situation with Scout Team Bravo went from urgent to critical at 1,801 hours, when the team's last known position was triangulated imprecisely to a sector 6 kilometers northeast. Their emergency beacon had activated briefly, then cut out. The communications officer's assessment was that either the beacon had been damaged by the weather or by something else, and the something else was what nobody in the command tent wanted to say out loud. Admiral Garrett stood over the map table with his hands flat on the surface. "I need a recovery team out there." "Sir, visibility is near zero," said Major Thomas Kirby, the senior operations officer. "Helicopter extraction is impossible. Ground vehicle navigation is severely compromised. Any team we send is operating effectively blind." "Then they operate blind," Garrett said. "I'm not leaving 6 soldiers in the field." Captain Hale stepped forward. "I'll lead the team. Take Alpha Squad, plus vehicle support. 2 MRAPs. Garrett straightened. "Move in 20. The team was assembling at the motor pool when Lena appeared. "I'm going with you," she said. Hale looked at her. Around them, soldiers were loading equipment, checking weapons, pulling on additional cold weather layers over their body armor. The wind screamed across the base at a pitch that made conversation difficult. The snow, real snow now, dense and disorienting, was beginning to accumulate in the vehicle tracks. "You're a civilian contractor," he began. "The eastern approach passes through 2 ambush positions," she said. "I can identify them. Your team can't. Not in this visibility. Not if they don't know what to look for." Hale studied her. She was wearing her jacket and cargo pants, the same civilian clothes she'd arrived in. She had retrieved something from her bag. He couldn't immediately identify it. "If you're wrong, I'm not." Something in the flat certainty of her answer, delivered without emphasis or apology, made him stop. He had known soldiers who were genuinely certain, not arrogant, not reckless, but specifically certain, the way surgeons are certain about procedures they have performed hundreds of times. He had also known plenty of people who performed certainty without possessing it. He looked at her hands. "Steady. Get in the vehicle," he said. The desert in blizzard conditions was a different planet. Out beyond the base's perimeter lights, the world collapsed to the MRAP's headlamp range, maybe 20 meters of visibility before the wind-driven snow closed everything off into a white-gray void. The GPS was unreliable. Sand in the atmosphere was interfering with signal acquisition. Staff Sergeant Owen Brackett, the driver, was navigating on dead reckoning and landmark memory, and the landmarks were disappearing under snow. Lena rode in the lead vehicle. She had not spoken since they left the gate, but she was watching not through the windshield, which showed nothing useful, but at the navigational display, at the compass bearing, at her own hands, which she held flat on her knees at intervals and then raised, as if testing the air pressure. Brackett glanced in the rearview mirror at Captain Hale. "We're about 2 kilometers out from the last known coordinates. Terrain should be flattening." "Should be," said Corporal Ray Tanner from the rear seat, with the specific skepticism of someone who has been in enough vehicles, in enough deserts, to know that terrain does exactly what it wants. Lena said quietly, "Slow down." Brackett looked at Hale. Hale nodded. The vehicle slowed. "Right side," Lena said. "At about 260 degrees. There's a prepared position, shallow scrape, 4 to 6 meters wide, behind the secondary dune line. You won't see it until you're past it." Tanner leaned forward. "How can you?" The sound came first, a sharp, violent crack that punched through the howl of the blizzard, and the MRAP's right front panel buckled inward as the round impacted and skidded along the armor plate without penetrating. The interior of the vehicle exploded into motion. "Contact right," Brackett shouted, cranking the wheel. "Stop the vehicle," Lena said, her voice still level. "We need to move. If you move, you'll drive into the second position. Stop the vehicle." Hale put his hand on Brackett's shoulder. The MRAP stopped. Another round hit, higher this time, against the roof armor. The Blizzard wailed. "Where are they?" Hale said. Lena was looking at the navigation display, at the compass, at some internal calculation that the rest of them couldn't read. 600 meters at 240 degrees, she said. Elevated position, they're using the reverse slope. Single shooter, maybe two. The wind is pushing left to right at approximately 30 kilometers per hour. She paused. They're going to adjust their aim in about 45 seconds. "How do you know that?" Tanner said. She didn't answer him. "I need the driver to maintain this position," she said to Hale. "I need access to the roof hatch." Hale looked at her for a long moment. Another round hit the left side panel. The vehicle rocked. "Bracket," Hale said. "Hold position." He reached past her and unlatched the roof hatch. She was up through the hatch before Hale could reconsider. In the blizzard, exposed from the waist up above the armored hull, she should have been nearly blind. The snow was horizontal, the wind was ferocious, and the darkness was total, except for the faint ambient glow of the base behind them. She had taken Corporal Tanner's rifle from the mount beside his seat without asking. He had not stopped her. Something in the speed and confidence of the motion had bypassed his instinct to object. The team inside the vehicle heard nothing for 7 seconds, then a single shot, then silence, a different quality of silence from the blizzard's constant roar, a silence that was an absence rather than a pause. Lena came back through the hatch. She handed Tanner his rifle. She settled into her seat. "One down," she said. "The second position is here." She pointed to a location on the navigation display. "They won't have a clean angle on us if we move laterally 20 meters left and proceed on a bearing of 045. The vehicle was completely quiet. Corporal Tanner was looking at her with an expression that Hale recognized as the specific human response to witnessing something that doesn't fit the category you've assigned it to. The face people make when they have to revise their understanding of something fundamental. That was Tanner started. "You fired once. At 600 meters, in a blizzard, at night. Wind compensation," she said, and the elevation differential made the geometry manageable. She looked at Hale. "We should move." "Who are you?" he said, not demanding, genuinely asking. The question of a man who needs accurate information to make decisions. "Someone you should listen to right now," she said. "We can have the other conversation when Bravo team is back at the base." He held her gaze for a moment. "Bracket," he said. 20 meters left. Then 045. "Yes, sir." As the vehicle began to move, Hale saw that Lena had already turned her attention forward, watching the snow-obscured distance with that particular quality of focus, still, patient, seeing things that the rest of them were going to see about 30 seconds later. He thought of the way she had stood at the perimeter that afternoon, watching the horizon. She had already been out there. In her mind, maybe literally, she had been reading this landscape since the moment she arrived. The second contact came 3 kilometers northeast of the first, when the blizzard reached its peak intensity. Visibility had dropped to less than 15 meters. Both MRAPs were running on compass heading alone, their GPS units showing only fragmented, unreliable data. The cold had deepened to the point where exposed skin went numb in under 2 minutes. Inside the vehicles, the soldiers were maintaining combat focus through the specific discipline of men who have been trained to function in discomfort, but the conditions were extracting a cost that showed in tighter jaws and slower responses. Lena said, "Stop here," and this time Brackett stopped without looking at Hale first. The trust had been earned. "I count 3 vehicles at approximately 200 meters, she said. "They're staged in a crescent formation eastern arc. They know approximately where Bravo team is, and they're waiting for them or for anyone coming after them." Hale keyed his radio. "Doyle, what's your position?" Sergeant Doyle, in the second MRAP, answered, 50 meters behind. "Pull up on my left. Engine off. We're going on foot." The vehicle stopped. 8 soldiers exited into the blizzard. The cold hit them like a physical object. Hale watched his team adjust, hunching reflexively, then straightening, the discipline reasserting itself over the body's protest. Lena was beside him. "We use the dune line as cover," she said, low and clear, speaking to the group. "Move parallel to the enemy position left flank. When I call it, the second element moves up the right while the first element engages." She looked at the soldiers. No independent fire. Controlled pairs. The wind is pushing sound left. They won't hear us until we're at 100 meters. Staff Sergeant Doyle, a man who had been in the Army for 16 years and did not take tactical direction from strangers under normal circumstances, looked at Captain Hale. Hale nodded. Doyle turned back to Lena. I need you to tell me this has a reason. The dune line masks our thermal signature, she said. Their vehicles are running engines hot, creating their own IR interference. At 100 meters in a blizzard, we have a significant advantage. At 200 meters with direct approach, we don't. She held his gaze. That's the reason. He nodded once and turned to his team. They moved through the blizzard in a broken single file, using the dune crests for cover. Navigating by compass, and by Lena's directional guidance, she moved without hesitation, correcting their bearing twice in small increments that turned out, when they reached the 100-meter mark, to have placed them exactly where she had said they needed to be. Left flank of the enemy formation, engines visible as dim heat shapes in the blizzard-choked darkness. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not the kind of combat that appears in official accounts. It was close and cold and disorienting, fought across 15 meters of visibility, and the advantage that Lena's positioning had created was decisive. The enemy formation, expecting contact from a different direction, adjusted too late. She did not only direct. When the engagement began, she was part of it, moving laterally, taking 2 precise shots from positions that used the terrain the way a mathematician uses given quantities, with no wasted motion and no wasted rounds. Private Renfrew, the one from Lubbock who had made the blanket joke, was the first to say it out loud, afterward, crouching behind a dune crest while the engagement wound down. She fights like she's done this 1,000 times, he said. Sergeant Doyle, beside him, did not answer. He was watching Lena, who was already moving toward the next position. They found Bravo Team's position 40 minutes after the second engagement. The team was sheltering in a shallow depression behind a secondary dune line textbook emergency cover, properly established, which told Hale that they were still coherent and functional despite the conditions. Sergeant First Class Elena Marsh, team leader, had dug the position with 4 of her soldiers. The 6th, Specialist Dave Kowalski, had a deep laceration on his left forearm from a round that had creased him during their initial contact and was packed and wrapped but needed proper medical attention. Bravo Team looked up when Hale's group came over the dune. Their relief was the specific, exhausted relief of people who have been telling themselves not to give up and have just been informed that they can stop. Took you long enough, Marsh said. Weather, Hale said. How many did you engage? Counted 6 on the initial contact. Don't know if they followed us or set up ahead. They set up ahead, Lena said. They knew the search corridor. Marsh looked at Lena for the first time. Who's the civilian? The question fell into a particular silence, the silence of 8 soldiers who had just spent an hour in combat conditions watching this woman do things that did not match the word civilian. Private Renfrew was the one who finally said, "She's not." Lena was checking Kowalski's arm, which she had asked to look at without explanation. Her hands moved with the rapid, confident efficiency of someone who had managed trauma injuries in environments where speed was the difference between an inconvenience and a crisis. She repacked the wound, tightened the wrap, and said, "This needs suturing in the next 2 hours. He's fine until then." "Who are you?" Marsh said directly. Lena stood. She looked at the group of soldiers around her, Hale's team and Marsh's team together now, 14 soldiers in a blizzard-swept hollow in the middle of a desert, watching her. "Special Forces," she said. "The contractor designation is cover for this assignment." The silence that followed was of a different quality than before. It was the silence of a revised understanding settling into place, the sudden reordering of everything they had observed in the past 6 hours into a new and coherent pattern. The observation of the satellite imagery in the briefing, the first position in the vehicle, the 600-meter shot in the blizzard, the tactical direction during the contact, the trauma assessment of Kowalski's arm. "What unit?" Sergeant Doyle asked. "That's not information I'm going to share in the field." He nodded. It was the right answer. People who were what she said they were did not share that information in the field. Hale said, "We need to move. Kowalski can't wait, and the weather isn't improving." He looked at the group. "Lena, I need you on point. You know this ground better than any of us." It was the first time he had used her first name in front of the group. Nobody missed it. "Yes, sir," she said, and turned toward the darkness and the snow. The return route was not the same as the approach. Lena called the change 300 meters from Bravo team's position when she signaled the column to halt and said, quietly, to Hale, "The path we came in on has been reoccupied. I can see vehicle signatures on the thermal scope, 2 vehicles, staged at the first engagement site. They've figured out the approach we used." Hale looked through his own scope. The blizzard was still at near peak intensity. He couldn't see what she was seeing. "Are you certain?" "2 heat sources, consistent with running engines, at the bearing of our first contact point. Yes." "Alternative?" She spread the tactical map on the frozen sand. She had one in her jacket, folded small, and she knew it well enough that she navigated by it in the dark with a small red light. "North-northwest route, 3 kilometers longer. We cross 2 dune fields. Visibility will be worse in the second one, but it avoids the staging area and brings us in on the base's northern perimeter where we have cover. Take us longer to get Kowalski in," said Sergeant Marsh. 20 minutes longer," Lena said. "Against an engagement with 2 vehicles if we take the direct route, and they're where I think they are." Marsh looked at Kowalski. He was walking under his own power, steady, his arm held close. He'd been told the situation. "I can do 20 minutes, Kowalski said. "I can do a lot more than 20 minutes if the alternative is getting shot at." They moved north. The northern route was harder in every physical sense. The dune fields were steeper, the footing was treacherous under the snow and sand combination, and the second dune field Lena had described was a disorienting maze of crests and bowls where the compass was the only reliable reference. Hale watched Lena navigate it, not confidently in the way of someone guessing, but confidently in the way of someone who had walked terrain like this enough times to have developed a physical intuition for it. She chose lines through the dunes that kept the column moving, correcting twice for the wind's effect on their bearing, managing the pace against Kowalski's condition. At the deepest point of the second dune field, farthest from the base, farthest from cover, with the blizzard still howling, there was a contact. A single shooter, poorly positioned, caught them from a bad angle. The fire was sporadic and inaccurate. Lena was already moving before the first round hit, directing the column into ground cover with 3 rapid hand signals, and the engagement lasted less than 90 seconds before the shooter withdrew. Private Renfrew, afterward, in the breathless pause before they continued, "Is she always like this?" Sergeant Doyle, "I don't know who she is, but yes." They reached the northern perimeter at 2,247 hours. The base's lights were visible through the blizzard as a dim, welcome glow. The gate guards, who had been told a recovery team was inbound, were watching for them, and the column came through the wire with Kowalski upright and walking, Bravo team intact, and nobody missing. Captain Hale keyed his radio. "Ridgecrest. This is Hale. Recovery complete. All personnel inbound. 1 requiring medical attention, non-critical. Over." The response from the command tent was a brief, professional acknowledgement. But in the background, before the transmission ended, Hale could hear the exhale of relief that passed through the room. Admiral Raymond Garrett received the recovery team in the briefing tent at 2,315 hours. He was still in full uniform. He had not slept. The operations staff around him showed the particular worn quality of people who have been managing a crisis for 6 hours and are experiencing the cautious, disbelieving loosening that comes when it resolves. Shoulders dropping by centimeters, voices losing their edge. Kowalski had been taken directly to the medical bay, walking under his own power, which was the first good sign. The rest of the team stood in the briefing tent, still in cold weather gear, boots wet, faces tight from the cold and the hours out in it. Garrett looked at his returned soldiers with the expression of a man who has been counting them and has arrived at the right number. "Bravo team is accounted for," he said. "All 7. 1 requiring medical attention, non-critical." A pause that acknowledged what it meant, briefly, before the professional moved on. "Good work out there. Debrief in the morning. Everyone get rest." He looked at Hale. "I'll want your full report by 0700. He was already turning back to the map table. There were follow-on operational decisions to make. The Eastern Corridor assessment needed updating. The weather system's projected timeline for clearing had to be revisited when Major Thomas Kirby, the operations officer, said, "Sir, there's a component of the team debrief you should look at tonight." The quality of Kirby's voice, carefully measured, specific, not alarmed but deliberate, made Garrett stop. He turned back. Kirby was not a man given to unnecessary emphasis. "Show me," Garrett said. Kirby set a tablet on the table. On it, a typed field summary, drafted by Captain Hale during the vehicle return, transmitted ahead of the team's arrival. The format was standard debrief, structure contacts, positions, outcomes, but the content was not standard. Kirby said, as Garrett read, 3 contacts total. The first, enemy sniper position at 600 meters, identified before engagement. Shooter neutralized with a single round by the civilian contractor. The second, enemy vehicle formation, 5 vehicles, broken through flanking maneuver called and executed by the civilian contractor. The alternate return route, called by the civilian contractor based on real-time assessment of enemy staging, which proved accurate. Trauma assessment and wound management of Specialist Kowalski, performed by the civilian contractor. Garrett looked up from the tablet. She fired the shot. "Yes, sir." Staff Sergeant Brackett, Corporal Tanner, and 3 members of Bravo team all independently corroborate. 600 meters. In those conditions. Single round. No adjustment fire. Wind compensation called verbally before the shot. The tent was quiet. Outside, the blizzard was still going. They could hear it pressing against the canvas walls, that relentless, inhuman roar that had been the background noise of the evening since 1742 hours. Inside, nobody moved. Garrett set the tablet down. He looked at it without touching it. Then he looked at Hale. "She's a civilian contractor," he said, not asserting questioning. Looking for the piece of information that would make the evening's events fit into a coherent framework. "I called in a records request on her file 40 minutes ago," Hale said. "Full clearance request, through the standard channel." The response came back during the return. He held out a printed sheet. "It came back fast, sir." Faster than standard. Garrett took the sheet. The header read, "Special Operations Command Classified." Below the header, in the format he knew from other documents he had seen over his career, the ones that described people who operated in spaces that most of the military didn't officially acknowledge, was a record, name, rank designation, classified, unit designation, classified, operational history, 8 active deployments, 4 distinct theaters. The performance summary was written in the flat, careful language of official records that was more revealing for what it underemphasized than for what it stated. Exceptional proficiency in long-range precision engagement. Demonstrated tactical leadership in small unit operations under extreme conditions. Advanced emergency trauma competency. And, at the bottom, in a commendation citation that was partially redacted, 3 lines of blacked-out text, then, "Sole surviving operator," a phrase that carried its own weight without any of the context it was withholding. Garrett read the sheet slowly. The way he read everything he needed to understand, rather than simply process. He read it once, and then he read it again. He set it on the table. He did not look at Kirby. He did not look at Hale. He looked at the sheet. Lieutenant Whitmore, who had been in the room for the return briefing, and who had made the comments that afternoon about bravery and naivety, was standing at the back near the entrance. He was looking at the floor with the specific quality of attention that people give to floors when they are trying not to be noticed, noticing something. "Where is she now?" Garrett said. "Medical bay. Sir, she's checking on Kowalski." A beat. Something moved through Garrett's expression, not a single identifiable emotion but several, in rapid, private sequence. "That will be all for tonight," he said. "Everyone get rest." The room emptied. Kirby left last, and he closed the tent flap behind him with quiet precision. Garrett remained at the map table alone. The canvas walls breathed with the wind. The lights overhead hummed at a frequency that was just at the edge of audibility. He stood and looked at the single printed sheet, and then he looked at the map, and then at the area that the evening's events had covered, the eastern corridor, the 2 choke points she had identified in the afternoon briefing, the positions where her assessments had been precisely correct. And he held all of it together in the mind of a man who had spent 40 years learning to think clearly about the gap between what he expected and what actually happened. He stood there for a long time. The snow had stopped by 0400. The desert in the hour before dawn was absolutely still. The blizzard had passed through and left behind a transformed landscape, the dunes reshaped into configurations that none of the soldiers on watch could match to their memories of the day before. The familiar landmarks, altered or buried, a thin white dusting that the rising wind would erase within hours, but which now, in the dark and cold before the sun came, covered everything in a silence that felt intentional. The base lights reflected off the snow and created an odd, diffuse glow across the compound, softer than the usual harsh glare. And in that glow, things looked both cleaner and more fragile than they usually did, like the base had been briefly translated into something other than what it was. Lena Ward was at the northern perimeter. She had been there for 20 minutes before Admiral Garrett found her. She had slept for 2 hours after leaving the medical bay, checked in on Kowalski, who was sutured and stable and already trying to make jokes with the night nurse, which Lena took as a reliable indicator that he was going to be fine. And then she had risen and come out to the perimeter without any particular agenda, except the ones she always had at the edge of darkness, to look at what was out there, to let the morning arrange itself, to be in the kind of silence that required nothing from her. The footsteps in the snow behind her were measured, unhurried. She had identified them as Garrett's before he was close enough to see. He walked with the slight right-side weight bias of a man who had had surgery on his left knee sometime in the last decade and had compensated so thoroughly he no longer noticed it himself. Admiral Garrett came to stand beside her at the wire. He was wearing his overcoat over his uniform. He was not carrying anything, no tablet, no file, nothing that framed this as a formal meeting or an operational discussion. He stood at a respectful arm's length and looked out at the same desert she was looking at. Neither of them spoke for a while. The horizon was beginning to lighten, the specific pre-dawn lightening that happens 20 minutes before actual sunrise, when the sky goes from absolute black to a deep, transparent blue that has no color in it exactly, but has a quality of depth, of distance, that makes the desert look both larger and more knowable than it does in daylight. The snow-dusted dunes in that light were something remarkable, pale and still, their new shapes unfamiliar, the tracks and disturbances of the night's events hidden under white. "I owe you an apology," Garrett said. He said it without preamble, without the diplomatic scaffolding that people sometimes erect around apologies when they want to explain why their mistake was understandable before they acknowledge it was a mistake. He said it the way soldiers say things when they have decided that plain language is owed. Lena was quiet for a moment. "You evaluated what was in front of you," she said. "That's the job." "The evaluation was wrong," he said. "And it wasn't just the briefing. It was this morning, the inventory assignment. I put you in the most useless position I could find because I'd already decided what you were." He looked at the desert. 40 years of reading people and I misread you completely in the first 30 seconds. "The cover is designed to be convincing," she said. "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said. "If I'd wanted the Admiral's briefing room respect, I'd have walked in with my actual credentials." She looked at him briefly. "I didn't." He absorbed this. "Why not? It would have made your work easier. People would have taken your assessment seriously." "I needed to see the base's actual state," she said. "Not the state it's in when everyone knows they're being watched by someone with authority. Those are different things." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "And what did you see?" She looked at the desert. "A well-run base with good soldiers," she said. "Captain Hale is exceptional. He noticed things about me that afternoon that your more senior officers didn't, and he acted on them when it mattered. Your NCOs are experienced and adaptable. Bravo team maintained their position and their discipline through 6 hours of deteriorating conditions without a single decision that made recovery harder." She paused. "You've built something good here." He looked at her. "That's not what I expected you to say." "I know," she said. The wind came across the dunes from the northwest, cold and steady, carrying nothing now except the dry smell of sand and the last ghost of the night's cold, and under that the faint, impossible smell of distance, the smell of how far from everything this place was. "7 people are sleeping in their bunks right now," he said. "That's the number that matters." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Captain Hale arrived with 2 cups of coffee. He came across the snow-covered compound with the slightly careful walk of a man who doesn't want to spill something hot in the cold, and he handed 1 cup to Lena and 1 to Garrett without appearing to find anything unusual about the configuration of the conversation he'd walked into. "Kowalski's asking questions," Hale said. "The night nurse says he wants to know who packed the wound." "Tell him the contractor," Lena said. Hale held his coffee in both hands and looked at the desert. "He already knows." Sergeant Marsh told him the whole story, apparently. She says he actually saluted when she got to the part about the return route. The 3 of them stood in silence for a moment. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have been through something together and no longer need to fill the space. "Can I ask you one thing?" Garrett said to Lena. "Yes. You knew how this would go. The briefing room, the assignment, the jokes. You've done this before, the cover, the dismissal, the reveal." He looked at her. "Does it get easier?" She considered the question without hurrying. Her breath was visible in the cold, small puffs of vapor that the wind took immediately. "It gets less surprising," she said. "People see what they expect to see. That's not a flaw. It's how pattern recognition works. You can't turn it off." She turned to look at him, and her expression was neither forgiving nor unforgiving. It was simply clear. The only thing that changes it is evidence, and evidence takes time. Garrett nodded slowly. This was, he understood, not just a description of the previous 24 hours. It was something she had worked out over many more of them. The sun broke the horizon. It came up fast, the way it does in open desert, a sudden gold edge on the distant dunes, then a widening, then the light was everywhere, flooding across the new landscape of the night's transformed desert, turning the snow from white to gold to the particular deep amber of early desert morning. The base came alive around them as the watch changed, footsteps crunching in snow, voices carrying in the cold air, the sound of vehicles starting, the smell of coffee from the mess tent competing with the clean cold of the morning. Lena drained her coffee and set the cup on the concrete barrier beside her. "I need to file my terrain assessment before I leave," she said, "and update the Eastern Corridor intelligence for your operations file." She looked at Hale. "I'll have it to you by 0700. "You don't have to," Hale started. "It's why I was sent," she said. "The rest was circumstance." He nodded. She turned and walked back toward the base, her boots leaving clean prints in the snow, and the 2 men watched her go. Garrett said to Hale, quietly, "How old is she?" Hale thought about it. "I don't know," he said. "The file doesn't say." They both looked at the retreating figure against the gold morning light, small and sure and unhurried in the vast desert landscape. "No," Garrett said. "I suppose it doesn't." At 0830, a vehicle came for Lena Ward. She had filed the terrain assessment at 0658, 2 minutes ahead of her self-imposed deadline, which was the kind of thing that Hale noticed and filed away. The document was thorough, specific, and written in the flat declarative style of operational intelligence that contains no unnecessary words and no hedged conclusions. It covered the Eastern Corridor in detail, the 2 choke points she had identified, the 3 contact positions from the previous night, the enemy staging behavior that suggested a pattern of operation rather than opportunistic positioning, and a set of recommendations for the extraction operation that was still scheduled for 48 hours out. It was, in Hale's assessment, when he read it at 0715, the kind of analysis that took most intelligence officers a week to produce. She had produced it in 5 hours, in the margins of a night that had included 3 firefights and a 4-kilometer cross-desert navigation in a blizzard. He had sent it to Admiral Garrett without comment. The response came back in 11 minutes. 4 words: update the operations brief, which from Garrett was the equivalent of a standing ovation. She had 1 bag. She had arrived with 1 bag, and she left with 1 bag, and the bag appeared to be exactly as full as it had been when she arrived, which meant either she had acquired nothing during her time at Ridgecrest, or she had acquired things that fit into the same compact space, and either interpretation was consistent with everything else. She came out of the bunk tent at 0815 and walked across the compound toward the gate. The snow was almost entirely gone by now. The desert morning had warmed enough to collapse it, and the dunes were returning to their sandy ochre, the strange pale transformation of the night, dissolving back into the normal. The tracks and scars of the previous day's operations were visible again. Vehicle ruts, boot prints, the disturbed sand of the motor pool. Soldiers watched her go from various positions around the base. They did so from a distance, and they did so quietly, and none of them waved or called out, which was not unfriendliness but the opposite, a kind of respect that expresses itself as restraint, the same instinct that makes people fall silent in the presence of something they recognize as significant. Private Renfrew was on watch at the northern perimeter. She passed within 10 meters of his position on the way to the gate. He had been thinking about what to say since approximately 2300 the night before, when he was still cold and his hands were still shaking from the firefight, and it had become completely, undeniably clear what kind of person he had made a joke about. He had spent 9 hours composing sentences in his head. Every one of them was wrong in a different way. She was going to pass him without stopping. "Ma'am," he said. She paused. She looked at him, a 19-year-old soldier from Lubbock, Texas, standing his watch in the thin desert morning, clearly working through something. He didn't say the sentence he'd prepared. He didn't say any of the sentences. "I'm sorry," he said, "about the blankets thing." She looked at him for a moment. There was nothing in her expression that punished him, and nothing that let him off too easily. She simply looked at him, as if she were seeing him accurately, which he realized was a thing she probably did all the time. "You did good work last night," she said. "Trust what you've got." She kept walking. He stood at his post for a long time after the gate closed behind her, looking at the empty desert, and he thought about that sentence, and he thought he was going to be thinking about it for years. Captain Hale stood at the gate and watched the contractor's vehicle until it crested the first dune and disappeared into the morning desert. The sky was clear, now scoured clean by the blizzard, blue and deep and empty, the kind of desert sky that made it hard to believe the previous night had happened at all. The dunes were already shifting back toward their pre-storm configurations, the brief white transformation erasing itself. He thought about the moment in the MRAP when he had given her the roof hatch. He had known at that moment that he was making a decision on incomplete information, that he was extending trust based on something he could not fully articulate, some accumulation of small observations that added up to a conclusion he couldn't prove. He had been right. He had also gotten lucky. Those two things were not the same, and he was honest enough to hold both of them. What he had gotten right was the observation itself, the quality of her attention, the steadiness, the specific way she looked at maps and horizons and situations, the things that didn't fit the category she'd been assigned to. He had noticed those things and he had acted on them, and that was worth something. Not everything, but something. He went back to work. Admiral Garrett was in the command tent. He had updated the operations brief, incorporating Lena's Eastern Corridor assessment into the planning for the extraction operation. He had initiated a review of the base's civilian contractor intake protocols, not a punitive review, not an after-action blame exercise, but a structural review of the information flow between contractor assignments and operational command. He had done both of these things before 0800, quietly, without making them into anything other than what they were. Corrections made by a person who takes corrections seriously. The printed sheet was still on the table. He had looked at it again while he worked. The redacted lines, the partial citations, the phrase that stayed with him, sole surviving operator. He thought about what that meant, what it cost, what it took, what it made a person. He thought about a young woman standing at the northern perimeter in the dark before dawn, looking out at a desert she clearly knew better than he did, with the calm of someone who has survived things by seeing them accurately. He thought about what he had said in that briefing room, and about the quality of the silence in which she had received it. He picked up the sheet and filed it under the correct classification. He closed the file. He turned back to the operational planning for the extraction. Outside, the desert was itself again immense and gold and indifferent, the dunes settling into their new shapes, the tracks and traces of the previous night disappearing by degrees as the wind resumed its ancient, patient work of erasure. The base continued its routines. Soldiers moved between tents, vehicles ran their checks, the mess tent served breakfast, and the smell of coffee and food moved across the compound in the cold morning air. In the medical bay, Specialist Dave Kowalski ate breakfast with his good arm and told the story of the previous night to the morning nurse. who had heard it already from 3 other sources and was still listening because it was a good story, the kind that gets better with each telling, not because anyone embellishes it, but because the teller finds, each time, another detail they'd forgotten to include. Somewhere northeast, beyond the wire, beyond the dunes, beyond the range of the base's perimeter lights, a vehicle moved through the morning desert. Its driver was following coordinates to a forward staging point, where a helicopter would take Lena Ward to the next thing, which was always the case, which was always the job. She sat in the back seat with her small bag and looked out the window at the passing desert, the shapes of the dunes, the quality of the light, the particular color of the sand at this latitude. In this season, the way she looked at all terrain, with the alert, cataloging attention of someone who might need this information later. She did not think about the previous night in terms of what had been proved or demonstrated or vindicated. She thought about the Eastern Corridor assessment and whether the extraction operation's timing accounted adequately for the enemy pattern she'd observed, and whether she had communicated the threat gradient clearly enough in the document she'd left with Hale. She thought Kowalski would be fine. His color had been good when she checked him. The wound was clean. The desert moved past the window in long, golden sweeps. She did not look back. She never did.